With 2019 officially coming to a close in the next few days, many Pokemon fans are now looking ahead to 2020 and wondering what could be next for the Pokemon franchise in the coming year. Even with Pokemon Sword and Shield still being very fresh in our minds, and even with them still having a ton for us to do, you kind of can't help as a Pokemon fan to wonder what could come next, and something that could come in the very near future, possibly as soon as next year, are the very highly coveted Pokemon Diamond and Pearl remakes. In today's video, we are going to be discussing the possibility of Pokemon Diamond and Pearl remakes coming out next year, and basically discuss all of the evidence we have that shows not only are these games going to happen, but they could even possibly happen and be out at this time next year. Before we do that though, I have got to give a big shout out and thank you to the sponsor of today's video, Raid Shadow Legends. Raid Shadow Legends is one of the most ambitious RPG projects of 2019 and is a mobile RPG done right. As one of the top 3 ranked RPGs on the Google Play Store, it's also been nominated as a finalist for Google Play's Best of 2019 User's Choice Award. Raid has an amazing storyline, amazing boss fights, hundreds of champions you can collect and customize, which I personally think is really cool, and it even offers PvP battles. It's also been downloaded almost 15 million times in just the last 6 months alone. Even better though is that it's also 100% free to download and play. The game even has innovative new features such as the multi-battle auto mode, which sets your battles to run automatically so you can spend less time grinding and more time on the things you enjoy the most. There's also the weekly tournaments and events, whether it be fighting in the arena, running special dungeons, or just leveling up your heroes. There's always a way to compete and win extra prizes. What's also awesome is that the developers also have huge updates planned for at least the next 6 months. So there's always going to be something new to discover. So go ahead and use the links in the description to download the game, and if you're a new player, you will get 100,000 silver, 2 clan boss keys, 10 mystery shards, and 1 free champion, the Executioner. I mean, look at this guy, he's awesome. You'll also be able to find these goodies right here once you download the game, and this offer is only good for 30 days, so you'll need to act fast. So use those links to download the game, and thank you again to Raid for sponsoring this video. Alright, so back to the topic at hand, are Pokemon Diamond and Pearl remakes going to happen next year? Well, before we look at the possibility that they could be coming as soon as next year, we should probably look at the evidence that they are going to be a thing. Given all of the fan demand and the fact that we have already received full-blown remakes for the first 3 generations of Pokemon games, it's basically an inevitability that we are going to get Diamond and Pearl remakes, but at the same time there is legitimate evidence out there that suggests that they are for sure going to happen. And when it comes to that evidence, there is actually a lot to be had, so I am going to be focusing in on a few points here that specifically lend themselves to the idea of Diamond and Pearl remakes happening within the current 8th generation of Pokemon. First, there is simply the idea of the remakes themselves. Remakes, both in video games and in Pokemon specifically, are often brought about because the developers want the fans to be able to play some of the older games in their franchise when those original games become older and harder to find. And in the case of Pokemon, this largely holds true, because other than the original Pokemon remakes, Fire Red and Leaf Green, every single mainline Pokemon remake has came out on a system after the last system in which the original was playable. So for instance, the Generation 2 remakes Heart Gold and Soul Silver came out on the original Nintendo DS, which was 1 generation after you were able to play the original Gold and Silver on the Game Boy Advance. That also holds true for Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, which came out on the 3DS 1 generation after you were able to play the original Ruby and Sapphire on the original DS. And in the case of Diamond and Pearl, this would have their remakes coming out on the Switch, as the last system before the Switch was the 3DS, and that was also the last system in which you were able to play the original Diamond and Pearl games, as the 3DS could play original DS games. So while that is just circumstantial evidence, it does provide for a nice foundation for the Diamond and Pearl remakes happening, and happening within this generation. But if we look a little more recently to the games that are currently out in Sword and Shield, they also provide some of their own evidence that suggests that the Diamond and Pearl remakes could be happening very soon, possibly even as the next games that come out after Sword and Shield. And this all begins with the Pokémon, because as we all know, the Pokédex in Pokémon Sword and Shield does not contain every single Pokémon out there, and was hand-selected by Game Freak, meaning every single Pokémon that was included or discluded was that way for a specific reason. And with that in mind, there is actually a pretty low number of Sinnoh Pokémon within the Galar Pokédex. Only 36 out of the 107 Sinnoh Pokémon make their appearance in these games, and many of those are evolutions and or pre-evolutions of Pokémon from other generations, meaning that they had to be there by association. So if you were to exclude those from consideration because of that, there are even less Sinnoh Pokémon overall. Another curious thing with the Pokédex in Sword and Shield have to do with the data mined Pokémon that have yet to be made available. There are a handful of Pokémon not within the Galar Dex currently, but are within the data of the games that are seemingly going to be made available at some point in time. However, within this group of Pokémon, there are absolutely no Generation 4 Pokémon to be had whatsoever. Given the timing of all of this, this is especially suspect, but another thing that makes it particularly curious is the fact that nearly every generation prior to Generation 8 is represented in this group of Pokemon. The only ones that aren't are the aforementioned Generation 4 and Generation 6. So why exclude these generations specifically, Generation 4 amongst them, of all things? It kind of just seems a little bit too convenient given the timing of everything, like I said. And finally, one more thing within Sword and Shield that heavily lends itself to the idea that Diamond and Pearl remakes are right around the corner actually comes from something that Birdkeeper Toby mentioned in one of his videos, so shout out to you, my friend. But that fact would have to do with Arceus, who is obviously one of the most important Pokemon who was introduced in Generation 4. As you probably know, Arceus has a number of plates associated with it that allows it to change its type, and for some reason, only one of these plates, despite Arceus not being in the game, is included in Sword and Shield, and that plate would be the Pixie Plate. Now this is especially curious because the Pixie Plate representing the Fairy type is the only plate that was not in the original Diamond and Pearl games, as the Fairy type had not existed yet. So to have it in Sword and Shield could not only be a sign that Diamond and Pearl remakes are right around the corner, but this could also be the way of getting the Pixie Plate into those games because it was not in the originals. So now that we've established the evidence in favor of a Pokemon Diamond and Pearl remake happening, we are now going to look at the possibility of it happening next year and whether or not that is likely. Before we get into it, I just want to say that personally, I think it's kind of a toss-up. It's obviously impossible to say one way or another, and honestly, there is evidence for both sides of this argument. So I'm just going to lay all of the evidence out there and let you guys decide for yourselves. First off, it is pretty likely that we are going to get a main series game of some kind in 2020, even though we had one this year, because we've had a main series Pokemon game every year for the last 4 years since 2016 with Pokemon Sun and Moon. And with all of the different games like the Sword and Shield follow-ups and the Diamond and Pearl remakes that are seemingly right on the horizon, I would say it's pretty likely that we are going to get a game one way or another. However, with that being said, there is also evidence of Diamond and Pearl remakes specifically happening in 2020 as well. And the first comes in the form of a social media post that the official Pokemon social media handles for Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, etc. made earlier this year. Earlier this year, all of the official Pokemon social media handles were doing a sort of showcase of all of the different generations, and when it came time to post about Sinnoh, they made a post with the caption, "Sinnoh confirmed." And this, of course, is a phrase that fans have been using in support of the Diamond and Pearl remakes anytime anything remotely resembling evidence of them happening appears online. And naturally, Pokemon themselves would clearly be aware of this, so for them to use this phrase in one of their official posts, they clearly know what they are doing, and they clearly would not use it if a Diamond and Pearl remake wasn't imminent within the next year or so. So I think based on that alone, we can reasonably expect a Diamond and Pearl remake to happen within the near future, possibly 2020. A 2020 release also lines up pretty well for the amount of time that it usually takes for remakes to come out, because ever since Fire Red and Leaf Green first came out in 2004, Heart Gold and Soul Silver followed up in 2009, which was 5 years after Fire Red and Leaf Green, and then Oraz came out in 2014, which was 5 years after Heart Gold and Soul Silver. So given that 2020 is 6 years after the Oraz release of 2014, it is about time for another remake to happen based on that timeline. And yet another timeline that speaks in favor of Diamond and Pearl remakes coming out in 2020 is the timeline of release between the original games and their remakes. So for example, Fire Red and Leaf Green, coming out in 2004, came out 8 years after the original. Heart Gold and Soul Silver, following suit, came out 10 years after the original, and Oraz came out 12 years after the original, with 2 years added on to every amount of time. So if we were to follow this trend for Diamond and Pearl, that would have the Diamond and Pearl remakes coming out 14 years after the originals, which would mean the Diamond and Pearl remakes would come out in 2020, since the original games came out in 2006. However, while that is a fairly convincing timeline, it also brings about another possibility that puts the 2020 timeframe in jeopardy, and that would be the idea of Diamond and Pearl remakes releasing on the 15th anniversary of the originals. As I just mentioned, if we were to get Diamond and Pearl remakes in 2020, they would be coming out 14 years after the original games came out. However, that leaves us just 1 year off of the 15th anniversary of these games in 2021, which definitely seems like it's worth celebrating, and what better way to celebrate than with the remakes coming out in that year. That alone, in my opinion, makes a 2021 release just as feasible as a 2020 release, and adding on to the support for that, if we were to have a 2021 release, that would allow the next Sword and Shield title, whatever it may be, to release in conjunction with Sword and Shield in 2020. Whereas if you release the Diamond and Pearl remakes in 2020, you would be breaking up the Sword and Shield titles with a remake in between, which just doesn't seem like the best way to go, in my opinion. And finally, as a last consideration, you do also have to consider the rest of the Nintendo Switch library as well, because as we all know, Pokémon was essentially Nintendo's Christmas title for this year. However, it's unlikely that with all of the other games on the Switch that we would have Diamond and Pearl remakes coming out as the next holiday title as well, since Pokémon games typically tend to come out around the holiday season. So it could very well be the case that Nintendo actually has another title that they want to use as their holiday title for 2020, which means that it would naturally be more advantageous for the Diamond and Pearl remakes to be held back for 2021, where they can take the spotlight as the premier holiday title for the Switch. And under this scenario, it could be such that we get the follow-ups to Sword and Shield next year, which wouldn't overtake any other holiday title that we might get, considering we've already seen and been introduced to the base Sword and Shield games, and then we could get the Diamond and Pearl remakes in 2021 for the 15th anniversary of those games. In my opinion, that makes a lot of sense, but there's also a lot of logic and reasoning with the 2020 release date as well, so ultimately, like I said, you guys are just gonna have to decide for yourselves. That's pretty much all of the evidence I have though, and like I said, it definitely is not conclusive one way or the other whether or not we're going to get the games in 2020. I obviously would be ecstatic if we did, and there is evidence to support it, but it's not necessarily confirmed either, so you guys are just gonna have to let me know what you think in the comments below. The one thing I would say is for sure though is that we are going to get Pokemon Diamond and Pearl remakes somewhere within the near future, so if you guys are hyped for Diamond and Pearl remakes, be sure to give the video a like if you enjoyed it, and subscribe if you're new for more Pokemon content all the time. I'd also like to give another thank you to Raid for sponsoring this video. It really does make a difference and supports the channel, so be sure to click the links in the description below to download the game and get those awesome rewards I talked about earlier. With all that being said though, I'll be back on Tuesday with another video, so be sure to hit that notification bell as well so you can know when it goes live. And with all that being said, I love you guys as always, and until the next one as always, I will smell you guys later.